The sound of tearing paper was deafening in that moment, sharper than any word, more violent than any accusation. My 9-year-old nephew Jude held the Comet 8-bit console aloft like a trophy, his small fingers wrapped around the custom-restored casing that had cost me 6 months of savings and countless nights hunched over restoration forums. It was pristine. It was perfect. It was Leo's 8th birthday present, and it was no longer his. "This is cooler than what I got, Mom," Jude announced, his voice cutting through the polite murmur of family guests like a knife through silk. "I'm keeping it." Beside the ruined wrapping paper, now scattered across our dining table like the debris of some small catastrophe, my son Leo stood motionless. His shoulders were curved inward, protective, defeated. Silent tears carved tracks through the frosting smudge on his cheek, and my heart shattered alongside the wrapping. Then came Camille's voice. She materialized the way she always did, perfectly timed, perfectly dressed, perfectly weaponized. My sister was 4 years my senior, and she had spent those 4 years, along with every single day that followed, making certain I never forgot it. She wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and her smile was the smile of someone who had already won before the battle began. "Jude has a point, Vivian," she said, her tone smooth as silk and sharp as fractured glass. "Leo does break everything. That console is valuable. It's an investment now, and it needs to be with someone who can properly appreciate its worth." She raised her champagne glass to me, and I watched the light catch the diamond on her ring, a ring she made certain to flash at every family gathering. That smile widened. "You're simply being overdramatic, dear. It's just a toy after all. Just a toy." The words hung in the air like poison gas, and I felt something inside me crystallize. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. Something that would become, over the next 6 months, a purpose so sharp it could cut through anything. I looked at my sister's face, at the smirk that had been her default expression whenever she looked at me for the past 20 years. And I made a choice. My name is Vivian Ashford, and I am 38 years old. For the past 20 years, my existence has been defined almost entirely by my sister Camille's low opinion of me. Not that she was subtle about it. Camille married into wealth at 24, marrying Philip Whitmore, whose family had old money and older connections. 3 years later, she founded the Heritage Group, a company that managed inherited family assets for wealthy families navigating the complexities of intergenerational wealth. In theory, it was a noble enterprise. In practice, it was a mechanism for Camille to consolidate power and information about every significant asset in our extended family network. She was brilliant at it. She was also ruthless. I, meanwhile, had dared to have a child outside of marriage at 19, a transgression my mother, Helena, never fully forgave, and Camille never stopped weaponizing. I chose a freelance life instead, IP consulting, asset recovery work, niche intellectual property cases. Low stress, flexible hours, perfect for raising a son alone, which meant it was in Camille's hierarchy of acceptable life choices, the modern equivalent of subsistence farming. My father, Walter Ashford, had been different. He was a brilliant, eccentric inventor who had designed everything from medical devices to sustainable energy systems. Before the dementia took him, he saw something in me that Camille and my mother refused to acknowledge. Intelligence, strategy, the ability to see patterns others missed. Walter had passed away 15 months ago, leaving behind an estate that should have been substantial, but Camille, as executor of the primary family trust, had somehow managed to make even that a source of shame for me. She controlled everything. I controlled nothing. Leo's birthday was supposed to be my moment. One moment of simple, untouchable joy. Then Jude took it. The next morning, I stood in my small kitchen, modest, organized, filled with the kind of careful minimalism that comes from never having enough money to be careless. and I felt the rage transform into something far more dangerous than fury. Glacial calm. I pulled out the framed photograph of my father from the mantelpiece, taken 3 years before he died. He was standing in front of the old Bramwell factory site, a sprawling industrial complex that Camille's company technically owned, but openly mocked as worthless. He was smiling, but there was something in his expression, a knowing quality that I had inherited from him, even if no one else had acknowledged it. Walter had always warned me about Camille and my mother. They're not malicious. He told me once, over wine after a particularly brutal family dinner. They're just small. And small people are always hungry. 6 months before Walter died, he'd given me restoration money for the Comet console. $12,000, handed to me in an envelope with a note in his shaking handwriting. This is the most valuable thing I will ever own. Finish it. Learn what it has to teach you. At the time, I thought it was nostalgia, Walter's way of connecting to our shared childhood, when he'd shown me how to read complex schematics before I could write properly. Now, looking at that photograph, at the expression in his eyes, I understood something different entirely. Walter wouldn't have spent $12,000 on a toy. The Comet was in pieces on my workbench, wrapped carefully in static-free cloth after last night's disaster. I'd retrieved it from the floor before Jude could damage it further, before Camille could succeed in her theft. The console itself was magnificent, the kind of restoration that took patience and expertise and love. But it was the custom-made cardboard shipping box that drew my attention now. I'd packed it carefully. I'd thought nothing of the engineering, the way the foam insert had been cut so precisely, the way the padding had been designed by someone who understood structural integrity at a molecular level. Walter had designed this box. My fingers moved with the precision of someone who had learned restoration work, who understood how to handle delicate things. I traced the edges of the foam insert, feeling for imperfections, for seams. Most people would never have found it. The seam was almost invisible, hidden in the internal casing of the power supply unit itself. I used a sewing needle, moving with surgical care. The foam separated with barely a whisper. Inside, wrapped in static-free foil, was a tiny object that should not exist in a 1980s gaming console. It was an EEPROM chip, a programmable memory chip, older in style, but clearly far too advanced for the era. Alongside it, like a secret letter waiting 20 years to be read, was a miniature leather-bound logbook no bigger than a matchbox. My hands trembled as I opened it. The handwriting was Walter's, precise, economical, the penmanship of an engineer who treated every mark on paper as a precision measurement. Dates, GPS coordinates, cryptic entries that seemed to come from some kind of surveillance log. The ground fault, subsurface anomalies confirmed, class 4 potential. The sleeping giant, dormant but active, sufficient for 50-year horizon. Surveyor Quinton failed to detect. Junior competence or deliberate blindness. Either way, the Heritage Group's valuation is fraudulent. And there, circled multiple times, the Heritage Group, the Heritage Group, the Heritage Group, Camille's company, circled like an indictment. I sank onto the stool in front of my workbench, and for the first time since that birthday disaster, I allowed myself to cry. Not from rage, from understanding. Camille hadn't stolen a gift. She had, without knowing it, stolen evidence. The coordinates in Walter's logbook led to the old Bramwell factory site, a sprawling industrial complex 20 miles outside the city. I'd seen Camille dismiss it 100 times, usually while holding forth about tax write-offs and Dad's worthless pile of rust to her colleagues over wine. Yet Walter's logbook was obsessed with it, not the factory building itself. He barely mentioned the structure. Instead, entry after entry fixated on the subsurface, the integrity of the deep strata, the thermal signatures, the geological formations beneath the earth. This was my specialty, the niche field I'd spent years studying: land and mineral rights, subsurface asset valuation, IP linked to natural resources. It was the very expertise Camille had spent 2 decades mocking as the self-indulgent hobby of a woman too unmotivated to pursue a real career. Walter had always known. He'd encouraged me to pursue it. The world runs on what's beneath the surface, Vivian. He'd told me the people who understand what lies below will always have power over those who only see the surface. I sat at my old workstation that night, Leo asleep upstairs, and began to work. The EEPROM chip required a simple hardware interface, something Walter had clearly engineered for accessibility. When I connected it, a prompt flashed on my screen: access code, console serial. I retrieved the comet's unique identifier, the custom VIN I'd recorded during restoration. My fingers moved across the keyboard, and the chip unlocked with a soft digital chime. What appeared on my screen made my breath catch. It wasn't files. It was a map, a three-dimensional, interactive, encrypted masterpiece of digital cartography. The Bramwell factory site, rendered in stunning detail, overlaid with layers of geological data. Most of the map was dark, but one specific layer glowed with vibrant color, deep reds and oranges that pulsed like a living thing. Geothermal potential, active class 4. Subsurface temperature, 385 degrees Fahrenheit. Stability index, 97.8%. Energy output projection, 847 megawatts, conservative estimate. I understood immediately. The sleeping giant wasn't a mineral deposit. It was the immense, untapped heat energy reservoir beneath the property, generated by a stable, deep-seated hot spring system that ran hundreds of feet below the surface. This was renewable energy of the kind that made governments rewrite their infrastructure plans. This was wealth that would dwarf anything the Heritage Group had ever managed. And Walter, a genius in thermodynamics whose patents had made him a modest fortune, had spent his final years documenting it. Not for Camille. For me. For Leo. I spent the next 12 hours cross-referencing Walter's digital survey with the Heritage Group's official 2005 Subsurface Rights Survey. That was the moment I found the fraud. The 2005 report had been signed off by a junior surveyor named Quentin Millhouse. It was thorough in its way. It documented the structural integrity of the old factory building, assessed the stability of the ground around it, noted minor thermal variations in the soil. But it completely, entirely, inexplicably ignored the deep geothermal data. A Class 4 geothermal site changed everything. Overnight. Fundamentally. The land value transformed from a tax write-off, a burden Camille had used for decades to offset her other holdings' appreciation, into a prime energy asset. A multi-billion-dollar prime energy asset, which meant the Heritage Group's current land appraisal, the one Camille was using as collateral for her massive new bank line of credit, was a massive undervaluation. And more than that, it was a critical breach of her fiduciary duty to the Walter Trust beneficiaries. To Leo, to me. I called my lawyer, Arthur Chin, the next morning. He had been my father's attorney before Walter died, and while Camille had tried to replace him with her own legal team, I'd maintained a relationship with him. Careful, professional, waiting. Arthur, I need to ask you something about the trust documents. Specifically, anything related to utility acquisition or infrastructure rights. There was a pause. That's an unusual question. Vivian, what's this about? I found something, I said carefully, something related to the Bramwell property, something Walter left for me. But I need to understand the trust mechanics before I proceed. Another pause. Then, come to my office. This afternoon. The legal wing of my law firm was cool and quiet, the kind of place where ambition and caution hung in perfect balance. Arthur was in his 60s, with gray threading through his dark hair and the kind of tired wisdom that came from 30 years of keeping people's secrets. He listened to me carefully without judgment as I explained what I'd found. I showed him Walter's encrypted map, omitting the specific geothermal heat signature for now. I showed him the EEPROM chip. I showed him the logbook with its cryptic entries about the sleeping giant and the fraudulent 2005 survey. Undocumented subsurface rights. I said, confirmed by my father's final work. I need to know if there's any mechanism in the trust documents that would give me leverage to recover those rights. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He disappeared into his firm's archives for 40 minutes. When he returned, he was holding a file, so old it looked like it might crumble. Your father was brilliant, Arthur said slowly. I'd almost forgotten about this. It's buried in the original trust documents, and Camille, I suspect intentionally, never brought it to my attention after she took over as executor. He opened the file and showed me a specific clause highlighted in ancient yellow marker that had faded to almost nothing. Heir Designated Utility Acquisition Trust. UAT if the primary asset of a related trust is found to possess a major, undocumented utility resource, the designated heir may exercise right of first refusal to purchase the land at its last appraised value, securing the utility rights for the next generation. This is ironclad, Arthur said quietly, and it's still active. It's a safety measure your father built in for scenarios exactly like this, where a subsequent executor might miss or deliberately obscure critical asset information. I felt something shift in my chest, something like hope. Who's the designated heir? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Leo. I needed two more things, a specialist in energy law and a way to make sure that when I moved, it would be too late for Camille to respond. Arthur introduced me to Meredith Vasquez, a woman in her early 50s who had spent 20 years specializing in renewable energy law and utility acquisition. Meredith listened to my case with the kind of intensity that made me understand immediately why she was legendary in her field. If the geothermal data is real, Meredith said carefully, and if the 2005 survey failed to document it, and if Camille has been using a fraudulent appraisal as collateral for loans, we're talking about criminal-level liability. Breach of fiduciary duty, at minimum, possibly securities fraud, depending on what she told her investors. I want to use the UAT, I said. I want to file the claim before she even knows we're moving. Meredith smiled. It was the smile of someone who had waited her entire career to help dismantle an empire built on someone else's negligence. How much time do we have? She asked. 2 weeks, I said. Maybe less. That same day, I called Camille. I heard you're selling Willowbrook, I said, keeping my voice even. Neutral. Unremarkable. The Willowbrook condo was technically mine. A small holding our grandfather had left to me directly in his will, the only significant asset that Camille, as executor of the larger estate, had failed to fully control. She'd buried it in paperwork for years, a perpetual irritant. Yes, Vivian, unlike you, I have to manage real assets. Camille sighed, that familiar tone of exhaustion mixed with contempt. I found a buyer. Quick closing. The sale will help with some larger investments I'm making. I want it back, I said. Silence. The kind of silence that told me I'd surprised her. I'll exchange it for something. I continued. I need to visit the old Bramwell factory, and I need unrestricted, digitized access to all its historical blueprints and land survey files. Starting today. The pause stretched. Then Camille laughed, a short, sharp, triumphant sound that made my skin crawl. You want to play industrial archaeology? Fine. I'll have my assistant, Penelope, set up access. But you get 2 weeks, Vivian. 2 weeks to play in the dirt with your precious blueprints. After that, the condo is mine, and you disappear from my sight. She made me feel small. That was Camille's gift. making people feel like they were trading their last piece of bread for a handful of dirt, which was precisely the illusion I needed her to maintain. Penelope Marsh worked as Camille's personal assistant, and she had, I suspected, a front row seat to everything my sister really was. She was a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes that held a weary sort of resignation. When I arrived at the Heritage Group's office to sign the NDA, Penelope handed me an external hard drive with steady hands. The office was cold and quiet, the kind of sterile luxury that Camille had perfected. All glass and marble, and the kind of minimalism that whispered about power rather than proclaiming it. "Be careful, Vivian," Penelope whispered as she handed me the drive, her voice barely audible. "Your sister is not a good woman. I've worked here too long not to see what she really is." It was a small kindness. After years of isolation, it felt enormous. I reached across the desk and squeezed her hand, and I saw something like recognition flicker across her face, the acknowledgement that I was not my sister's equal, but I might become her match. "Thank you," I said. That night, with Leo safely asleep, I inserted the hard drive into my workstation and began to work. The files were exactly what Camille had expected me to find: outdated structural blueprints of the old factory building, environmental reports dating back decades, and the mandatory 20-year subsurface rights survey commissioned in 2005. It was a dense, boring pile of dry documents, the kind of thing designed to overwhelm and exhaust. But I wasn't looking at the surface documents. I connected Walter's EEPROM chip to the system and opened the encrypted map. This time, I zoomed in on the deepest layers, the subsurface data that made my breath catch. The geothermal potential wasn't localized. It was vast. The heat signatures extended across nearly 40% of the property, fed by a deep thermal aquifer that had been stable for geological ages. This wasn't a fluke. This was a significant renewable energy resource, the kind of thing that would change the trajectory of an entire region's energy infrastructure. And nobody was supposed to know about it. I spent the next 72 hours building my case. I cross-referenced Walter's data with publicly available geological surveys. I researched the history of thermal surveys in the region. I compiled every document that proved the 2005 survey was inadequate, that it had missed something fundamental, that the land had been catastrophically undervalued. By the third day, I had everything I needed. I called Arthur. "I'm ready. Are you ready?" "Meredith and I are prepared," Arthur said. "When do you want to file?" I checked Camille's calendar through a mutual acquaintance. She had a press conference scheduled at the Bramwell factory site, 5 days away, a grand announcement about her innovative restructuring and her visionary leadership. She was going to plant her flag on that land, stand in front of journalists and investors, and declare victory. Perfect. File the day before. I said, make it a public court filing. Make sure the bank sees it immediately. Camille, predictably, began her psychological warfare immediately. She called our mother, Helena, daily, crying about my betrayal over the blueprints. Helena called me that afternoon, her voice dripping with disappointment, that particular flavor of maternal criticism that had defined my entire adolescence. "Vivian, why are you doing this to your sister? You know how stressed she is with this big deal. She's trying to save the Heritage Group, and you're trying to ruin her out of sheer jealousy." It was gaslighting, pure and simple, designed to make me panic, doubt my moral standing, confess. I didn't panic. I drove to my mother's house the next morning. Helena lived in an estate on the north side of the city, a monument to good taste and better wealth management. The house had always felt cold to me, even in summer. I sat across from my mother at her marble kitchen table, my expression perfectly calm. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue. I simply handed her a laminated spreadsheet. "Mom, This is the amount of Leo's education fund that Camille quietly borrowed and never repaid from Walter's estate over the past 5 years. She told you I spent it recklessly on frivolous things. Here is the proof of her transactions. Direct transfers. No repayment schedule. No acknowledgement. Helena's face crumpled, not with remorse, but with the shock of being used, of discovering that the person she'd always favored, always trusted, had been lying to her for half a decade. "I don't expect you to call me," I said, standing. "I don't expect an apology. I just wanted you to know what you've been supporting all this time. I'm severing my emotional tie here, Mom. I'm done." I walked out, leaving her to face the quiet lie she had been living. I had never felt lighter. 5 days before the press conference, Arthur filed the lawsuit. The filing was elegant in its simplicity. The Leo Vance Trust v. the Heritage Group regarding heir-designated utility acquisition and fraudulent asset appraisal. It was a public court filing. The bank was notified within hours. The legal documents outlined, in precise, devastating language, exactly what I had discovered: the existence of Class 4 geothermal resources, the complete failure of the 2005 survey to document these resources, the resulting undervaluation of the Bramwell property, the breach of fiduciary duty by the Heritage Group's management. The filing did not yet mention the full geothermal potential. That was the ace card, saved for the moment when Camille had already overcommit herself, already moved beyond the point of damage control. Camille panicked. I knew she would. She called me that afternoon, her voice no longer smooth or controlled. It was shrill, panicked, the voice of someone whose entire world was collapsing faster than she could comprehend. "You little snake, what is this nonsense? The land is worth nothing. It's just an old factory. I'm suing you for slander, for defamation, for—" I let her rage. I waited until her voice had worn itself hoarse with fury. Then I spoke one calm sentence. "Camille, the land is worth whatever your own surveyors appraised it at in 2005. You signed off on that valuation. Read the UAT clause in the original trust. Walter designed it specifically to protect against this." She hung up. The silence that followed spoke volumes. The bank, seeing the public court filing and the legal challenge to their primary collateral, did exactly what Arthur had predicted. They pulled the loan. Camille's multi-million-dollar line of credit, the entire funding mechanism for her upcoming investments, simply evaporated. No negotiation, no discussion, just a simple letter. Due to material changes in collateral status, this credit facility is hereby terminated. She called the bank's head directly. I know this because Arthur got a call from the bank within the hour. They wanted to understand what was happening. They wanted to know why a property they'd appraised as worthless was suddenly at the center of a legal fight. Arthur arranged a meeting. He brought me. He brought the full geothermal survey. He brought Walter's encrypted map and his logbook and every piece of evidence that proved the Bramwell factory site was worth not $3 million, but somewhere in the range of $1.2 billion in renewable energy potential. The head of the bank, a man named Richard Chun, no relation to Arthur, actually went pale. She knowingly submitted a fraudulent appraisal, Richard said slowly, staring at the geothermal data. She knew this land had potential, and she appraised it as worthless for tax purposes, and then tried to use that appraisal as collateral for a secured loan. That's not negligence, Ms. Ashford. That's fraud. Which is why we're here, Arthur said quietly. We're offering the Leo Vance Trust as a more reliable partner in developing this asset. Richard looked at me, really looked at me, not as a woman, not as Camille's younger sister, but as someone with demonstrable expertise, someone with evidence, someone with legitimacy. The bank will support the UAT filing, he said after a long moment. Not because we trust you, Ms. Ashford, but because we cannot be associated with your sister's fraud. Better to cut our losses and work with you. Camille didn't surrender. That was never part of her DNA. Instead, she did what she had always done. She doubled down on the performance. She scheduled the press conference at the Bramwell factory site itself, a final, theatrical statement that she was in control, that her empire remained unshaken. She even had security staff bar Leo and me from the property. I received a notice 3 days before. Ms. Vivian Ashford and her guest are not permitted on the premises during the scheduled media event. It was a mistake. It was also delicious. The morning of the press conference, I woke early and watched the live stream feed on my laptop. Camille stood in front of the dilapidated factory building, wearing a pristine white suit that probably cost more than my car. She was surrounded by journalists and nervous investors, people who had money tied up in the Heritage Group and wanted reassurance. She gave them a prepared speech about vision and legacy and the company's innovative restructuring. Her smile was perfect. Her hair was perfect. Everything about her was designed to project absolute confidence. Then, mid-sentence, the camera panned. A specialized drilling truck pulled onto the edge of the property, painted with the logo of Renault Energy Solutions, one of the largest renewable energy development firms in North America. It moved slowly, deliberately, escorted by court officials in dark suits. Camille's smile froze. Arthur emerged from the truck, followed by Meredith. He was carrying a stack of papers thick enough to be a small novel. He walked directly to the podium where Camille was standing, and he placed those papers on the lectern, covering her prepared notes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur said, his voice booming over the sound system, "I am Attorney Arthur Chin, representing the Leo Vance Trust. This property, the old Bramwell factory site, is no longer owned by the Heritage Group. Effective immediately, by court order under the Air-Designated Utility Acquisition Clause, all ownership and subsurface rights have been transferred to the Leo Vance Trust." Camille lunged forward, grabbing the microphone, her voice a shriek that shattered the careful image she'd constructed. "This is a fabrication. I own this land. This is a publicity stunt." Arthur calmly waited for her to finish. His expression didn't change. Then he continued, his voice steady and precise. "The court agreed with the Leo Vance Trust's filing. The documentation proves that the Heritage Group failed its fiduciary duty by ignoring documented multi-billion-dollar geothermal utility resources beneath this property, resources confirmed by geological surveys, private thermal imaging, and expert analysis. These resources are now legally secured for the next generation of the Walter family. The Heritage Group's fraudulent appraisal, combined with the deliberate or negligent failure to identify these assets, constitutes a material breach of trust." He paused. Let the silence settle. "Additionally," Arthur continued, "the bank has reviewed Ms. Camille Whitmore's loan application and has determined that it constituted fraud. Federal authorities have been notified." Camille's face crumpled. It wasn't the composed expression of a woman losing a business deal. It was the raw, exposed face of someone who had just realized that her entire empire, built on lies, on manipulation, on the exploitation of people who loved her, had collapsed in the span of one sentence. The reporters swarmed her, but not with questions about restructuring. They were shouting about fraud, about fiduciary duty, about the sleeping giant. Camille tried to speak, tried to explain, but her voice was lost in the chaos. I watched from my laptop at home, Leo sleeping in the bedroom above, and I felt something settle into my chest. Not triumph, not yet, something quieter. The satisfaction of justice executed with perfect precision. The satisfaction of knowing that my father had planned for this moment, had left me the tools to build it, had trusted me to see it through. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of my new headquarters, a custom-built, highly efficient office space powered entirely by geothermal energy harvested from the former Bramwell factory site. The space was gorgeous, warm with tones, natural light, the kind of quiet sophistication that comes from confidence rather than performance. The Vance Walter Geothermal Trust had become one of the region's primary renewable energy development entities. We were generating clean, sustainable power for 17 municipalities. We were creating jobs. We were building a legacy. But the most important thing was in the glass case in the center of the lobby. The Comet 8-bit console, restored to its original beauty, sat on a velvet mount with a small brass plaque beneath it, the key to everything, Walter Ashford's final gift, 2024. Leo, now 8.5 years old, sometimes came to the office after school and stood in front of that case. He understood, on some level, that something important had happened, that his mother had been clever, that his grandfather had loved us in a way that transcended death and time. I had hired Penelope away from the Heritage Group within 3 months. She was now my operations manager, and she brought with her the kind of quiet loyalty that came from finally choosing the right side. Camille and Philip had disappeared into a mire of legal battles. The Heritage Group had been dissolved. The Securities and Exchange Commission was investigating Camille's loan applications. The FBI had opened a fraud investigation. She had hired 3 different defense attorneys and was running out of money fast. The irony being that she destroyed her own empire trying to prevent me from accessing what was already mine. I had not sought petty revenge. I had simply taken back what was mine, legally, intelligently, with devastating precision. My mother had called once, 3 months ago. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply said, "I understand now," and hung up. I hadn't returned the call. Arthur had recommended me to other families with complex asset recovery needs. The consulting firm I built, Ashford Asset Recovery Specialists, was thriving. We focus on unique cases, discovering hidden assets, identifying undervalued resources, protecting generational wealth from those who would exploit it through negligence or design. There was a demand for what I did. There were more Camilles in the world than anyone wanted to admit. I stood at my office window one evening, watching the sun set over the city, and I thought about my sister, about how she had spent 20 years trying to keep me small, trying to convince me that I was weak and unreliable and unworthy. In the end, she had been defeated not by anger, but by intelligence, not by vengeance, but by competence, not by what I had against her, but by what she had never bothered to see in me. Walter had known. He had always known. I pulled out my phone and called Leo. "Hey, sweetheart. Want to come see the sunset from the office? I have something I want to talk to you about." He arrived 20 minutes later, still in his school uniform, his hair slightly disheveled from the day. He was growing up so fast. He was going to be brilliant. I could already tell. The kind of brilliant that didn't need to hurt anyone to matter. We stood together at the window, watching the light fade from gold to crimson to deep purple. "Mom," Leo said, "why is the console in the case? Shouldn't you play with it?" I smiled. It was a special gift from Grandpa Walter. It helped us both get here, to this place, to this life. It's precious, so we keep it safe. And someday, when you're older, I'll tell you the whole story of why. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does this have to do with why we don't see Aunt Camille anymore?" "Yes," I said honestly. "But that's a story for when you're a little older. For now, just know that your grandfather was the smartest person I ever knew, and he made sure that we would be okay, that we would have a future." Leo reached over and took my hand. His small fingers wrapped around mine with a certainty that made my heart ache, the certainty of a child who believed that his mother could handle anything. And I could. I would. I had learned that strength wasn't about how much you could take. It was about how clearly you could see. It was about patience. It was about knowing when to wait and when to strike, and striking with the precision of someone who had planned every detail. It was about honoring the legacy of people who believed in you, even when the world didn't. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and the city lights began to twinkle on. Somewhere in the darkness, Camille was losing everything. Somewhere in the light, I was building something that would last. I had won not by becoming like her, but by being something she could never understand. Intelligent, patient, and ruthless in the pursuit of justice. I smiled, and I thought of Walter's final note, tucked inside the comet's empty shell, the words I had found only after the victory was already secured. To my brilliant daughter, the world has never appreciated what lies beneath the surface. They see only what glitters on top. But you have always understood. This console was never a toy. It was a map. It was a message. It was my faith in you, encrypted in the most beautiful way I could imagine. Whatever you do with this gift, know that I have always seen you clearly. I have always known who you really are. Love, Walter. Leo squeezed my hand. Outside, the city glittered with a million lights, each one a possibility, each one a life built on someone else's clarity and courage. I had inherited my father's legacy, and now I was building it into something more. The sleeping giant had awakened, and it would provide warmth for generations to come. The Vance Walter Geothermal Trust ceremony was held at sunrise on the 1-year anniversary of the Bramwell discovery. We had broken ground on the first commercial geothermal energy facility, a project that would generate enough clean, renewable power to supply 3 metropolitan regions. Leo stood beside me, no longer 8, but 9 now, the age Jude had been when he tried to steal his birthday gift. Leo wore a small suit, and he understood, somehow, that this moment mattered. Meredith gave a speech about renewable energy. Arthur spoke about justice and vision. News crews recorded everything. But the moment I remember most clearly is when they asked me to say something standing in front of the massive geothermal drilling equipment that bore our family name, bearing the weight of my father's legacy and my own determination. I stood at that podium, and I looked directly at the cameras, directly at the people watching, and I spoke clearly. My father taught me that strength isn't about taking from others. It's about seeing what others missed. It's about patience. It's about building something that will outlast anger, outlast regret, outlast all the small, bitter people who try to keep you small. This energy comes from the earth. It's ancient. It's renewable. It's sustainable. Just like the kind of legacy that matters. Thank you. As I stepped back from the podium, I caught sight of a news ticker scrolling across one of the broadcast monitors. Camille Whitmore sentenced to 5 years federal prison for securities fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. She would serve her time. She would lose everything. She would have years to contemplate the moment she decided that stealing a child's birthday gift was worth more than her integrity. Some people only understand consequences after they experience them. I didn't feel satisfied by her suffering, but I felt satisfied by my own success, by the knowledge that I had built something true, something lasting, something that would provide warmth and light to thousands of people who would never know my name. That was enough. That was everything. If you've made it this far, you understand. Respect is non-negotiable. My sister, Camille, spent decades defining my worth by her seating chart. The failure, the unreliable one. She didn't just steal my son's Comet console. She tried to steal my right to exist as an intelligent person. My silence wasn't weakness. It was the precision required to study her mistakes. I used the very knowledge she mocked, obscure land rights, and trust law to collapse her billion-dollar empire. The revenge wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the surgical, public seizure of the land itself and its geothermal potential. She never saw the air-designated utility acquisition coming. Patience is power. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who's been gaslit into invisibility. Your worth was never in question. It was only waiting to be remembered. Subscribe and comment below. Have you ever had to prove your worth to a family that underestimated you? Write your own ending.